Look at her. They sent us a doll to play soldier. What you gonna do? Cry as she drops the rifle. The sneering voice of Cadet Miller, sharp and serrated, cut through the hallowed quiet of the National Cemetery. The crowd, a nervous assembly of his fellow cadets from the academy, laughed. It was a brittle, uncertain sound, the kind of laughter that seeks permission and validation, echoing weakly between the stoic rows of white marble that stretched to the horizon. They were the nation's future, the best and the brightest. But in that moment, they were just boys, following the lead of the loudest and most confident among them. The target of their derision, Sergeant First Class Eva Rostova, did not react. She stood a dozen paces away, her back to them, ostensibly overseeing the placement of training markers on the ceremonial grounds. Her posture was a study in stillness, a ramrod straightness that seemed less a conscious effort of muscle and more the natural state of her bones. She offered no verbal retort, no defensive glance over her shoulder, no stiffening of her spine. Her silence was a void, absolute and impenetrable, into which Miller's insult simply vanished without a trace. From the shaded portico of the Memorial Chapel, Command Sergeant Major Davies watched, his eyes narrowed to slits. He was a relic from a harder era, a man whose face was a roadmap of forgotten conflicts and whose presence radiated a gravity that could bend light. He wasn't watching the preening cadet. He was watching the woman. He saw what the boys, blinded by their own unearned confidence, could not. He saw the subtle, almost imperceptible way her boots were canted, distributing her weight with an efficiency that could sustain a motionless vigil for hours, not minutes. He saw the worn leather of her rifle sling, not cracked from neglect, but softened and darkened from 1,000 hours of practiced handling. But it was her hands that held his attention. Her fingers rested on the stock of her ceremonial M1 Garand, not curled or tensed, but lying flat and straight, a picture of placid control. It was a small detail, a forgotten technique from old manuals, a way to maintain perfect readiness without a hint of tension. It was the grip of a true professional, the kind of detail that separated those who played soldier from those who had buried them. A cold not formed in the pit of his stomach, a premonition of a lesson about to be brutally taught. If you believe true honor is forged in silence, type respect below. The air itself felt ancient, heavy with the scent of damp earth, freshly mown grass, and the faint, metallic tang of distant city life. Each headstone was a silent testament, a final, unblinking statement of a life given in service. For the cadets, this was a stage, a prestigious backdrop for the next phase of their immaculate careers. For Sergeant Rostova, it was something else entirely. It was a library of ghosts, a sanctuary of sacrifice. Cadet Miller, emboldened by the lack of response, continued his monologue. He was a caricature of youthful arrogance, his jaw sharp, his uniform tailored to perfection, his every movement a performance for an imagined audience. He saw Rostova's silence not as strength, but as weakness. He saw her gender and her slightly older age not as signs of experience, but as evidence of a lowered standard, a political concession. She's probably here on some diversity initiative, he whispered loudly to his sycophants. Probably never spent a day outside of a headquarters building. They put her in charge of this detail to check a box. The cadets shuffled their feet, their earlier laughter fading into a more palpable discomfort. They were on sacred ground, and the persistent disrespect was starting to feel like a desecration. Yet, none of them dared to challenge Miller. His academic record was flawless, his physical prowess unmatched, and his ambition was a palpable force that swept others along in its wake. To stand against him was to risk becoming an outcast. So they remained silent, their complicity a stain on the crisp autumn air. Rostova, meanwhile, continued her work. She moved from one marker to the next with a fluid, methodical grace. There was no wasted energy, no hesitation. Her movements were a form of communication in themselves, telling a story of countless repetitions, of discipline drilled so deep it had become instinct. Her focus was absolute, a concentrated beam of intention that rendered the cadet's chatter into meaningless background noise. She wasn't ignoring them. In her world, on this field, they simply did not register. The rifle she carried was another piece of the puzzle the cadets failed to see. It was an M1 Garand, yes, the standard for this ceremonial unit, but it was different. The walnut stock was darker than their fresh-from-the-armory pieces, bearing a deep, lustrous sheen that spoke of decades of hand polishing with linseed oil. There were nicks and scratches in the wood, tiny scars of a long and storied life, each one a silent memory. The steel of the receiver had a faint, plum-colored patina, the result of countless heating and cooling cycles, a sign of a weapon that had been fired, not just carried. This was not a prop. It was a tool, a relic, an extension of its wielder. CSM Davies saw it all. He saw the arrogance of the untested, the quiet dignity of the proven, and the impending collision between the two. He knew that assumptions were the most dangerous enemy on any battlefield, whether a muddy trench or a manicured lawn. And he knew that Cadet Miller had just made a catastrophic one. The young man believed the world operated on the logic of his textbooks and the hierarchy of his academy. He was about to learn that out here, in the shadow of the honored dead, a different, more profound authority held sway. The formal training exercise began under a sky the color of slate. A sudden shift in the weather had brought a gusting wind that whipped through the cemetery, tearing at the flags and making the airfield 10 degrees colder. It was a complication, an unscripted variable that introduced a genuine element of chaos into the carefully orchestrated simulation. The scenario was a full honors funeral for a 4-star general, the most complex and demanding ceremony in the manual. The drill sergeant, a stern but fair man named Gunther, barked out the assignments. "Miller, you're the NCOIC of the firing party. You got the top scores. Let's see you lead." A smirk touched Miller's lips. This was his arena. He thrived under pressure, or so he believed. "Sergeant Rostova." Gunther continued, his tone respectful but slightly dismissive, as if assigning a trivial task to a visiting dignitary. "You'll act as the overall safety officer and final inspector for the party." It was a token position, a way to include her without giving her any real authority. Miller's smirk widened. He would be giving the commands. She would merely be watching. He turned to his 7-man firing party, a hand-picked selection of the Academy's best marksmen. "Listen up," he began, his voice straining to project over the wind. "We do this by the book, but with precision. I want 3 cracks, not 21 pops." "Understood." The cadets nodded, their faces grim with determination. As they took their positions, Rostova approached the line. She moved behind them, her presence a silent, looming shadow. She didn't speak. She didn't instruct. She simply observed. Then she began to act. She stepped behind the first cadet, a lanky boy whose sling was a fraction of an inch too loose. Her hands moved with a blur of efficiency, tightening the leather strap with a single, practiced pull. The cadet flinched, startled by her touch. She moved to the next, subtly adjusting the angle of his elbow, bringing it tighter to his body to create a more stable firing platform. She continued down the line, a silent whirlwind of minute corrections. A thumb moved from the side of the stock to the top. A cheek weld shifted by a millimeter. A foot angled outward by a single degree. Miller watched her, his irritation growing. "Sergeant, with all due respect, my team is prepared. Your interference is not required." Rostova finished with the last cadet and turned to face him. She did not look at his eyes. She looked at his rifle. Her gaze was heavy, analytical. She stepped forward, and for the first time, Miller felt a flicker of uncertainty. She reached out and placed a single finger on the stacking swivel on the front of his M1 Garand. "Your on-block clip is seated incorrectly," she said. Her voice was low, devoid of any emotion, a simple statement of fact. "It will cause a feed malfunction on the 3rd round of the 2nd volley." Miller stared at her, dumbfounded. How could she possibly know that? He had loaded the rifle himself, meticulously. "My weapon is fine, Sergeant," he said, his voice tight with defiance. Rostova held his gaze for a beat longer, then gave a single, almost imperceptible nod and stepped back, her duty done. The judgment was rendered. The choice was his. The first command from Miller was sharp, a textbook example of military bearing. Firing party ready. The 7 cadets moved as one, bringing their rifles up. Aim. They leveled the heavy weapons, their sights aligning on a point just above the distant tree line. But the wind was a malevolent force, pushing against them, making their muscles tremble with the strain. Miller could feel the instability in his own stance. He hesitated for a fraction of a second too long, his timing thrown off by the wind's assault. Fire. The result was a disaster. A ragged, stumbling volley of shots, a cacophony of individual reports that sounded more like a string of firecrackers than a solemn tribute. It was a sonic representation of failure, a sloppy, disrespectful noise that hung in the sacred air. Gunther winced visibly. The other cadets, watching from the sidelines, shifted uncomfortably. Miller's face flushed with a mixture of rage and humiliation. He glared at his team, then at the wind, then at the sky, looking for anything to blame but himself. He opened his mouth to bark a correction, to berate his men, but before he could utter a sound, another voice sliced through the wind. Party, it was Rostova. The word was not shouted. It was spoken with a strange, resonant power that seemed to absorb all other sound. It was a command that did not ask for attention, but seized it. The 7 cadets, who had started to lower their rifles in confusion, froze instantly, their bodies responding to the sheer authority in that single word. Miller was speechless. She had usurped his command. Reload, she commanded, her voice calm and even, a steady rhythm against the howling wind. The cadets fumbled for their clips, their confidence shattered. Cadet, Rostova said, her voice now directed at the boy whose sling she had tightened. Breathe, from your belly. Match me. She took a slow, deliberate breath, and the boy, his eyes wide, found himself mirroring her. She did this for each of them, not with words, but with a look, a nod, a shared moment of calm. She was not just their commander. She was their anchor. Then she turned her attention back to the whole party. The wind is not your enemy, she said, her voice carrying effortlessly. It is a constant. You do not fight it. You yield to it. You become a part of it. Feel on your cheek. Anticipate its push. Let it settle you. Now, on my command, she paused, letting the silence stretch, letting her words sink in. The wind seemed to die down for a moment, as if listening. Party. Ready. The movement was smoother this time, more unified. AIM, 7 rifles rose as one, a single fluid motion. They seemed steadier now, rooted to the earth. Rostova's eyes scanned the line, and then she gave the final command. Fire. The sound was not a sound. It was a physical event. A single, titanic crack that slammed into the chest and echoed across the valley. It was the sound of a giant oak tree splitting in a thunderstorm. It was perfect. A deafening, absolute silence followed, broken only by the whistling wind and the faint tinkle of 8 brass casings ejecting onto the grass in perfect unison. She did not pause. Ready. Aim. Fire again. The world split open with the sound of a single, unified shot. Another wave of thunder rolled over the silent stones. The aftermath was a vacuum of disbelief. Gunther stood with his mouth agape. The cadets in the firing party looked at their own rifles, then at each other, then at Rostova, their expressions a mixture of awe and terror. Miller was ashen-faced, his arrogance stripped away, leaving only raw, naked shock. He looked at Rostova, who stood perfectly still, her face impassive, as if she had done nothing more remarkable than tying her boot. That's not possible, Miller whispered to himself, the words lost in the wind she had so effortlessly commanded. From the chapel, Command Sergeant Major Davies began his walk. His stride was slow, measured, each step landing with the finality of a judge's gavel. The crunch of his boots on the gravel path was the only sound in the stunned silence, a rhythmic beat drawing every eye toward him. He was no longer just an observer. He was an agent of revelation, a figure of judgment moving inexorably toward the center of the drama. He walked past the still gaping drill Sergeant Gunther without a glance. He passed the line of wide-eyed cadets, his gaze fixed forward. He came to a stop in front of the pale and trembling Cadet Miller, pausing for a moment to let the young man feel the full weight of his silent condemnation before moving past him as well. He finally stood before Sergeant Rostova, who remained at a perfect parade rest, her eyes focused on the middle distance. Davies did not address her. Instead, he reached out slowly and gently took the M1 Garand from her hands. He held it not like a weapon, but like a sacred object, his movements full of a reverence that seemed entirely out of place on a training field. He cradled the dark walnut stock, his thumb tracing the grain. Then, he turned to face the assembly of cadets, his expression as hard and unyielding as the granite of the monuments surrounding them. "You," he began, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that was more felt than heard. "Think you know what it means to be a soldier. You read books. You passed tests. You wear a uniform. You believe that makes you worthy of standing on this ground." He paused, his eyes sweeping over their young, bewildered faces. "You are children, playing games with tools you don't understand, in a church you have not earned the right to enter." He lifted the rifle for all to see. "This is not a Model 1903 Springfield rifle with a welded barrel, like the toys you carry. This is a fully functional, combat-issued M1 Garand, serial number 3,451,882. It was manufactured in December of 1944. It likely fired its first shots in the Ardennes forest. And since then, it has served in only one unit." He ran his thumb over a small, tarnished brass plate, no bigger than a postage stamp, that was inlet into the side of the stock, a detail so subtle no one had ever noticed it. "This rifle has a name. It is called the Keeper. It is not a sign from an armory. It is passed from one hand to the next, only when the previous bearer is gone. It is the ceremonial weapon and the sacred trust of the commander of the Honor Guard for Task Force Echo 7. You may know them by their unofficial name, the Sentinels." A murmur went through the cadets. They had all heard the rumors, the ghost stories about Echo 7, a unit that didn't officially exist. The name hung in the air, thick with myth and menace. The Sentinels. They were the boogeymen of the Special Operations world, a unit spoken of only in whispers in secure briefing rooms and late-night barrack sessions. They were not an assault force. They were an organization of ghosts, tasked with the missions that were deemed too sensitive, too secret, or too final for any other unit. Their primary function was recovery and repatriation, but not of the living. They were the military's secret undertakers. When a soldier fell in a place the nation could never admit to being, when a pilot was shot down over a country with whom there was supposed to be peace, when an operative's identity was compromised beyond recovery, the Sentinels were sent. They moved through the shadows of the world to bring the fallen home, or, if that was not possible, to perform the final rites on some forgotten patch of foreign soil, ensuring that no American soldier was ever truly left behind, even if their name could never be entered into the public record. They were the guardians of the anonymous dead, the keepers of a nation's most painful secrets. Their motto, it was rumored, was Silentium et Sinis, silence and ashes. CSM Davies let the weight of that unspoken history settle over the young men. "The Sentinels do not guard the tomb of the unknown soldier here," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, forcing them to lean in. "They're a living tomb for soldiers whose names will be forever unknown. They conduct the funerals that will never be recorded. They fire the salutes that no family will ever hear. They fold the flags that will never be presented." He held up the rifle again. "And this rifle, the Keeper, has fired the last salute for more heroes than there are stones in this entire cemetery." His gaze locked on a Miller's, and the cadet felt pinned by the sheer force of the old soldier's will. "You asked what she was going to do. You mocked her. You judged her by the cover of her book, too arrogant and too ignorant to even try to read the first page." Davies pulled a small, hardened data slate from his pocket and activated it with his thumb. The screen glowed with blacked-out lines of redacted text. "Let's review the service record of your instructor, shall we? Name, Sergeant First Class Eva Rostova. Current unit classification. Tier 1 Special Mission Unit, Detachment Echo 7. Primary Military Occupational Specialty, Redacted. Secondary, Redacted. Combat Deploiement, 14. Locations, all classified. Mission types, all classified above top secret. He looked up from his slate, his eyes burning with a cold fire. Awards, a Silver Star for actions in the Hindu Kush. 3 Bronze Stars with V4 Valor devices. A Purple Heart from an IED strike outside of a city that does not officially exist. And the Distinguished Service Cross for, well, the citation is just a single black line. Her official title for this temporary assignment is Instructor, Ceremonial Drill and Protocol. Her real title, the one that she has earned in blood and silence, is Sentinel Prime. She is the commander of the Sentinels. Davies deactivated the slate and slipped it back into his pocket. Then he did something that none of the cadets had ever seen before. He turned to face Rostova. He took a deep breath, and his entire body seemed to shift, his posture transforming from that of a senior NCO to that of a subordinate. He brought his right hand up in a salute so sharp, so precise, so full of unadulterated respect that it was breathtaking. It was not the casual salute between peers. It was the salute a knight gives to a queen. "Ma'am," he said, his voice cracking with an emotion he had not shown in decades. "It is an honor to be in your presence. My apologies for the profound ignorance displayed by these trainees." He then turned his head slowly, his eyes locking back on Miller. "Cadet, from this moment until your departure from this installation, you will address this non-commissioned officer only as Sergeant Sentinel. You will not speak to her unless spoken to. You will learn the meaning of silence. You will learn the meaning of respect. Is that understood?" Miller, his face as white as the surrounding headstones, could only manage a choked nod, his world completely and irrevocably shattered. The story of what happened on the ceremonial training field spread not like wildfire, but like a pressure wave from a detonation, a silent, powerful force that expanded outward, shaking foundations. It traveled first through the ranks of the Old Guard, the elite ceremonial unit stationed at the cemetery, passed in hushed tones between sentries during the changing of the guard. From there, it seeped into the encrypted networks of the Pentagon, an anecdote shared between colonels and generals who understood the true significance of the name Sentinel. It became a legend in the barracks of the military academy. The tale of Miller's folly, a cautionary parable whispered to new cadets about the mortal sin of assumption. The arrogant quote, "What's she gonna do? Cry if she drops the rifle?" became a piece of institutional folklore, a punchline that was never funny, only humbling. The two perfect, thunderous volleys became the stuff of myth. Known as the Rostova Standard, the legend painted Sergeant Sentinel as a spectral figure, a ghost of righteous discipline who could appear at any time to measure the worth of a soldier. She was no longer just a woman. She was an archetype, a living embodiment of the quiet professional. For Cadet Miller, the event was not a humiliation, it was an exorcism. The arrogant, brittle persona he had so carefully constructed was blasted away, leaving behind a raw, humbled, and introspective young man. The world was no longer a ladder for him to climb, but a vast, complex landscape of things he did not know. He saw his own ignorance laid bare, and it terrified him. The day after the incident, he formally requested to be assigned to Sergeant Rostova for remedial training in drill and ceremony. His request was seen as an act of profound penance. The training was brutal in its simplicity. For hours on end, Miller stood on the same patch of grass where his pride had died, holding his rifle at parade rest. Rostova would stand nearby, sometimes for hours, saying nothing, her mere presence an unbearable weight of expectation. She did not yell or berate him. She did not need to. Her silence was a far more potent instructor. She was teaching him to be still, to find strength not in motion or speech, but in absolute, unwavering composure. She was teaching him to listen to the world instead of shouting at it. Weeks passed. Miller's swagger vanished, replaced by a quiet intensity. His movements became more economical, his voice lower, his gaze more focused. The change was so profound that his fellow cadets began to look at him with a newfound respect, a respect he had never earned with his perfect scores and loud boasts. The culmination of his penance came on his final day at the cemetery. He approached Rostova as she was cleaning the keeper near the edge of the training grounds. He did not speak. He simply came to attention and executed a flawless manual of arms, his movements crisp and precise, ending with a perfect present arms, offering his own rifle for her inspection. It was a gesture of complete and total submission to her standard. She rose, took his rifle, and inspected it with meticulous care. She checked the sling, the balance, the cleanliness of the bore. She found no flaws. She handed it back to him and, for the first time, looked him directly in the eye. She gave a single, sharp nod of approval. No words were exchanged, but for Miller, that silent gesture was a medal of honor. He had not been forgiven. He had been acknowledged. He had finally begun to understand. Rostova, for her part, seemed utterly unaffected by the legend growing around her. She deflected every attempt to praise or question her. When Drill Sergeant Gunther approached her, stammering an apology, she simply cut him off. "You assigned me as safety officer, Gunther. I saw an unsafe condition in the firing party's timing, and I corrected it. That's the job." To her, the impossible feat was not a display of skill. It was a simple course correction, a duty performed. Her focus remained steadfastly on the mission, not the mythology. She was seen, in her off hours, not at the NCO club or the mess hall, but walking alone among the rows of headstones, her hands clasped behind her back. She would occasionally stop, read a name, and stand in silent communion for a few moments before moving on. She was not a legend or a ghost. She was a custodian, a professional mourner for a nation that too often forgot the price of its freedoms. Her quiet competence was her creed, her actions the only sermon she would ever preach. The physical evidence of her lesson, however, took on a life of its own. The 8 brass casings from each of the 2 perfect volleys were collected from the field. A young specialist from the old guard, who had witnessed the event, took it upon himself to polish them to a mirror shine. He mounted them on a simple plaque of dark walnut, the wood sourced from a fallen tree on the cemetery grounds. The inscription he carved beneath the casings was stark and powerful, the Rostova standard. One sound, one soul. The plaque was hung in the main day room of the old guard barracks, a place where every soldier assigned to the prestigious unit would see it every single day. It became a touchstone, a physical reminder of the impossibly high standard of perfection they were all expected to meet. The spot on the training field where Rostova had stood to deliver her commands was also memorialized, albeit unofficially. The groundskeepers seemed to cut the grass there with a little more care. The cadets and soldiers who trained there would avoid stepping on that precise patch of turf, giving it a wide berth as if it were consecrated ground. They called it Sentinel's Mark. It was a place where arrogance had been humbled and where a profound lesson had been taught, a lesson about the immense power of demonstrated competence over the empty noise of self-aggrandizement. The story and its artifacts became woven into the fabric of the institution, a permanent part of its culture, ensuring that the lessons Sergeant Sentinel had taught would not be forgotten. It was a legacy built not on words, but on the deafening echo of 2 perfect shots. Years passed. The crisp autumn day at the cemetery became a distant, yet formative, memory. Miller, no longer a cadet, was now Captain Miller, a company commander in the 101st Airborne Division. The crucible of combat had forged him into the kind of leader Rostova would have respected, quiet, calm, decisive, and fiercely protective of his soldiers. The arrogance of his youth had been burned away, replaced by the heavy wisdom that only comes from leading men and women in harm's way. He was visiting the National Cemetery on a short leave, walking the familiar paths not as a trainee, but as a pilgrim. He made his way to the training grounds and saw a scene that was achingly familiar. A new group of sharp, cocky cadets from the academy, their chests puffed out, their voices loud, being briefed by a drill sergeant. He saw his own reflection in their youthful swagger, in the easy confidence that had not yet been tested by failure. He saw the same casual disrespect for the hallowed ground on which they stood. A pang of memory, sharp and humbling, went through him. He felt a duty to intervene, to pass on the lesson that had been so brutally and so necessarily beaten into him. He approached the group, his presence as a combat-tested captain immediately commanding their attention. The drill sergeant recognized the combat infantryman badge and the ranger tab on his uniform and snapped to attention. "Sir," he said. Miller waved him to be at ease. "I was a cadet on this field once," Miller began, his voice quiet but carrying a weight that made every young man listen intently. "I thought I was the best. I thought I knew everything. And on this very spot, I was taught that I knew nothing." He didn't tell them his own name or the specifics of his personal failure. He understood now that the lesson was bigger than his own shame. He told them the story of a visiting sergeant, a quiet woman who everyone underestimated. He told them about the sloppy first volley, the disrespectful noise that they had made. And then he described the voice that had cut through the wind, the voice that had imposed order on chaos. He described the two thunderous cracks that had followed, the sound of perfection. He told them about the keeper rifle and about the ghosts known as the sentinels. He told them about a standard of performance that was absolute, because it was born from the sacred duty of honoring the unhonored dead. As he spoke, he could see the arrogance draining from the cadets' faces, replaced by a dawning sense of awe and humility. They were no longer seeing a training field. They were seeing a crucible. "The highest honor you will ever have," Miller concluded, his gaze sweeping over them, "is not the rank on your collar or the medals on your chest. It is the quiet trust of the soldiers to your left and to your right. It is the competence you demonstrate when no one is watching. It is the silence you keep when your ego wants to scream." He pointed toward the distant old guard barracks. "In that building, there's a plaque with 16 shell casings on it. It's called the Rostov's Standard. Before you leave this place, I suggest you go and look at it. And you think about what it means to make one sound with one soul." He gave a nod to the drill sergeant, turned, and walked away, leaving behind a group of profoundly changed young men and a legend that had just been passed to a new generation. The legacy of Sergeant First Class Eva Rostova was never a statue in a parade ground or a building named in her honor. Her name would never be known to the public she so faithfully protected. Her true legacy was quieter, deeper, and far more enduring. It was in the bearing of a young captain who led his troops with quiet confidence instead of loud bravado. It was in the hushed reverence of a new generation of cadets who now understood that the ground they stood on was purchased with a currency of sacrifice they could barely comprehend. It was in a standard of absolute perfection that echoed not just in a training manual, but in the institutional soul of those tasked with the nation's most solemn duties. Her legacy was a ripple effect of humility, a chain reaction of competence. She had taught, through one singular, undeniable act, that a person's worth is not measured by the volume of their voice, but by the precision of their actions. She proved that respect is not a right to be demanded, but a consequence to be earned through silent, disciplined effort. She never sought to be a legend, which is precisely why she became one. Her story became a foundational myth, a teaching tool more powerful than any textbook, because it illustrated a fundamental truth of service. True strength is not about the power you wield over others, but the discipline you have over yourself. It's not about winning arguments. It's about becoming the argument that cannot be refuted. Rostova's life was that irrefutable argument. It was a testament to the idea that a life lived with such honor, such precision, and such profound humility creates its own gravity. Her presence, even in its absence, continued to set the standard. The quiet professional, the Sentinel Prime, had left her mark not by carving her name in a stone, but by engraving her principles onto the hearts of those who would follow. True legacy isn't what you leave behind in your wake. It's what continues to move forward long after you are gone. For more stories where quiet competence triumphs over loud assumption and where silent discipline defines their worth, subscribe to Unknown Heroine Tales.